Chapter 1. The Harvest Table. The village of Little Dornford took its annual harvest supper rather more seriously than perhaps was strictly necessary. This was the considered opinion of Inspector Gerald Brent of the Warwickshire Constabulary, who had grown up in a terraced house in Coventry, where harvest was a word that appeared on the side of biscuit tins, and meant very little beyond that. But Little Dornford was not Coventry, and the harvest supper at St. Crispin's Parish Hall was not, as he would discover too late, an occasion for casual opinions. It fell on the 3rd Friday of October. Always, the date was as fixed as the church calendar itself, and the preparations began fully a fortnight in advance. Mrs. Evelyn Price, who chaired the harvest committee with the serene authority of a woman who has never doubted herself in any significant matter, commenced her loaves on the Wednesday morning. They were the centrepiece of the long trestle table, 4 great rounds of cottage bread, glazed with egg wash until they shone like polished oak. Beside them sat preserves from a dozen different gardens, dark damson jam, quince jelly the colour of amber, a chutney that old Mr. Selby made each year from a recipe he claimed had come over with his grandmother from Worcestershire, and would not share with anyone living. The hall smelled of warm bread and beeswax, and, underneath both, the faint mustiness of a building that had stood since 1887, and was not embarrassed by the fact. It was, in every respect, a thoroughly ordinary evening. Miss Jane Marple arrived at 6:30 with Mrs. Bantry's niece, a cheerful young woman named Louise, who had driven her over from St. Mary Mead, and was already looking about the hall with the bright, unguarded curiosity of someone who has never been to Little Dornford before, and finds it charming. Miss Marple had been to Little Dornford many times and found it rather familiar, which is to say, she found it very much like everywhere else, which is to say, she found it quietly fascinating. She settled herself in a chair near the side wall, where she could see the room without appearing to study it. This was her customary position at such events, and it suited her very well. She wore her good grey cardigan and had brought her knitting, and which she did not intend to use, but which gave her hands something to do, and her eyes something to hide behind. The room was filling pleasantly. There were perhaps 40 people in all, a comfortable number for the hall, enough to give the evening a feeling of warmth without the friction of a crowd. Miss Marple, as was her habit, began to arrange them quietly in her mind. There was Dr. and Mrs. Hartley near the punch bowl, he red-faced and hearty, she wearing the expression of a woman who is accustomed to standing slightly behind her husband and has opinions about this. Their son, a young man of perhaps 24, named Philip, stood with his hands in his pockets near the far window. He was talking to no one, which Miss Marple noted, though she noted it without conclusion, and the Price family occupied the area near the trestle table, in the manner of people who have organized the event and feel entitled to stand close to it. Evelyn Price herself moved between guests with a focused hospitality, guiding people toward the bread, pressing preserves upon the hesitant. She was a large woman with pale, steady eyes, and the particular energy of someone who requires activity to remain calm. Her husband, George Price, stood somewhat apart, speaking at length to the vicar. George Price was a quiet, somewhat sagging man who had once been, Miss Marple understood, quite a successful property solicitor in Leamington, and had retired 5 years ago to Little Dornford, which was his wife's village, not his. He had the look of a man who had made accommodations. At the far end of the hall, laughing at something a tall man had said, was a woman who immediately drew the eye, not aggressively, but by some quality of ease that is rarer than beauty. She was perhaps 35, with dark hair and a kind of natural stillness that persisted even when she laughed. Miss Marple did not know her, but she knew the type, in the way that a naturalist might know a species of bird from a single glimpse of its wing. She was a woman who had once been the centre of someone's world, and knew it, without being particularly vain about the fact. Louise leaned down to murmur, "Who is that? She's lovely." "I don't know," said Miss Marple, "but I noticed Mrs. Price has looked at her 3 times since we came in." Louise glanced at Evelyn Price, then back. "Do you think they know each other?" "I think," said Miss Marple mildly, that it rather depends on what you mean by know." The evening passed agreeably. The bread was admired. The chutney provoked the usual gentle controversy. Philip Hartley, Miss Marple observed, eventually stopped standing alone and joined the dark-haired woman's group, and the tall man who had made her laugh was introduced to him, and shook his hand with the hearty ease of a man to whom social situations present no difficulty whatsoever. He was, she would learn, a Mr. David Ashworth, lately arrived in Little Dornford. He had taken the lease on Rook Cottage for the winter. He was some variety of writer, or so it was said. He was unmarried. He smiled a great deal. At 20 minutes past 8, Evelyn Price set out the bread in slices, with small knives and ramekins of preserves. It was the moment the evening had been building toward, and people moved to the table with the cheerful appetite of those who have waited politely and are now rewarded. At 25 minutes past 8, Mrs. Price herself took a slice, spread it with the dark damson, and handed it with a quiet, particular smile to the dark-haired woman, whose name Miss Marple had by now discovered was Clara Vain. Clara Vain ate it. She said it was delicious. She moved away. By 9 o'clock she was very ill indeed. By 1:30, Dr. Hartley had sent for the ambulance. By morning, Clara Vain was dead. Chapter 2. What the Village Knows. By 7 o'clock the following morning, Little Dornford knew. This was not remarkable. Villages of a certain size have their own nervous system, a web of telephone calls and garden fence conversations, and the particular efficiency of the woman who delivers the post and has always delivered rather more than letters. By the time Miss Marple came down to breakfast at Mrs. Fellows's guest cottage, where she was staying the weekend at Louise's insistence, the news had already arranged itself into the shape the village preferred. A story with a cause, a direction, and if not quite a villain, then at least a strong candidate for the role. Mrs. Fellows herself supplied the opening summary while pouring tea. Food poisoning is what they're saying. Something in the preserves, or perhaps the bread itself. Though of course Evelyn Price's bread has never poisoned anyone in 30 years, so I can't think it would start now. She set down the pot. They're saying the police will want to speak to everyone who ate from that table last night. And did many people become ill? Miss Marple asked. That's just it. No one else. Not a soul. Mrs. Fellows delivered this detail with the quiet gravity of someone who understands its weight. Only Miss Vain. Miss Marple buttered her toast with the unhurried attention she gave to small tasks. I see, she said. Of course, Mrs. Fellows continued, lowering herself into the opposite chair. People are saying all sorts of things. You know how it is. Some are saying it must have been something she had earlier in the day. Something in her own kitchen. She lived alone, you know, at the old Benham house. Rented it for the summer, stayed on. Oh, no family nearby? No family at all? None that anyone here knows about? Mrs. Fellows paused. She was a private sort of person, pleasant, mind you, but private, kept her own hours. And then, of course, there's the question of Mr. Ashworth. Miss Marple looked up with the expression of polite, slightly vague interest that she had perfected over a long life of finding it useful. Mr. Ashworth? Well, Mrs. Fellows folded her hands on the table, in the manner of a woman settling into the telling of something she has already rehearsed once or twice. He and Miss Vain were friendly. That was plain enough to anyone with eyes. And he's only been here since September. Same as her, more or less. She left a meaningful pause. People are wondering. Wondering what, precisely? Whether they knew each other before. Whether they came here together, in a manner of speaking, separately, but together. Mrs. Fellows gave a small, expressive shrug. It's not impossible, is it? Miss Marple agreed that it was not impossible, finished her toast, and said she thought she might take a short walk before the morning became too cold. The village green was quiet. A thin mist hung at hedge height, softening the outlines of things without quite obscuring them. Miss Marple walked slowly, as she always did, with her hands clasped behind her back, and her eyes moving with the comfortable liberty of someone who is expected to look at nothing in particular. She had not gone 50 yards before she encountered Philip Hartley. He was sitting on the bench near the war memorial with the rigid, inward look of a young man who has been awake all night and has not yet decided whether to be angry or devastated. He was perhaps 24, though he looked younger in the morning light. Younger, and somewhat stripped of whatever composure he had managed the evening before. "Good morning," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "Dreadful business." Philip Hartley looked at her without recognition, then made the minor adjustment of a person remembering his manners. "Yes," he said, "dreadful." "Did you know Miss Vain well?" There was a pause just long enough to be noticed. "Not particularly. I'd met her a few times since she moved into the village." He looked away, at the mist above the hedgerow. "She was good company." "She seemed so," Miss Marple agreed. "Mr. Ashworth appeared to think so too." Something shifted in the young man's face, small and quick, like a card turned over and immediately covered. He didn't know her as well as he seemed to think, he said. Then, as if hearing his own words for the first time, "I only mean he'd only been here a few weeks. People form impressions quickly, and they're not always accurate." "No," said Miss Marple mildly, "they often aren't." She left him there, staring at the mist, and walked on. Inspector Brent had set up his preliminary interviews in the vestry of St. Crispin's, a narrow room that smelled of old hymn books and wood oil, and which did not lend itself to comfortable conversation. He was a competent man, methodical and conscientious, and he had already concluded by mid-morning that the most likely explanation was accidental contamination of the preserves. Botulism, or something of that nature. The laboratory results would confirm it. He was explaining as much to Sergeant Oakes when the door opened and Mrs. Price was shown in. She sat down across from him with the contained stillness of someone who is frightened and refuses to show it. Her hands were in her lap. Her pale eyes were very steady. "I've made the bread for this supper every year for 31 years, she said before he could speak. "I use the same recipe, the same flour, the same method. There is nothing wrong with my bread, Inspector. We're not suggesting the damson jam is my own. I put it up in August, as I do every August. 48 jars. My family has been eating it since September. No one has been ill." She stopped. Then, more quietly, "I gave Clara Vain that slice. I chose it, and I gave it to her. I know how that appears." Brent studied her. "How would you say it appears, Mrs. Price?" She met his gaze directly. "It appears as though I meant her harm." She let the silence settle around this statement. "I did not. Had you any reason to wish her harm?" The pause this time was different in quality. Not the pause of someone finding words, but the pause of someone deciding which words to find. "Clara Vain," she said at last, "was a young woman who took things that belonged to other people. That is not a reason to poison someone. It is simply a fact." She folded her hands more firmly in her lap and said nothing further. Through Chapter 3. The Things People Do Not Say. There is a particular kind of listening that most people never learn. It requires the suspension not merely of speech but of opinion, the willingness to receive what is said without immediately arranging it into something more convenient. Miss Marple had practiced this variety of listening for the better part of 7 decades, and had found it, without exception, more instructive than any question she might have put directly. She spent the better part of Thursday doing very little that would have appeared to a casual observer like anything at all. She sat with Mrs. Fellows in the morning and heard about Clara Vain's arrival in Little Dornford the previous June, how she had come quite suddenly, taken the Benham house on a 6-month lease, and settled into village life with a pleasantness that was genuine without being warm. She walked to the post office at 11 and heard from Mr. Dodd behind the counter that the police had been asking questions about the preserves, and that Evelyn Price had telephoned the vicar the previous evening and spoken for 40 minutes, which was unprecedented in Mr. Dodd's experience, as Mrs. Price was not a woman who used the telephone for anything she could not say in 5 minutes. In the afternoon she accepted an invitation to take tea with Dr. and Mrs. Hartley at their house on Church Lane, which was a solid Victorian structure that smelled of pipe tobacco and responsible living. Mrs. Hartley, Margaret, was the kind of woman who made very good tea and could not sit still while others drank it. She moved about the drawing-room with the efficient restlessness of someone whose children have grown, and whose husband requires very little, straightening objects that did not need straightening, opening curtains that were already open, returning finally to her chair, with the look of someone who has run out of reasons to stay standing. "Philip is taking it very badly," she said without preamble. "He won't say so, of course. He's like his father that way." They were acquainted, he and Miss Vain, Miss Marple said. He was very taken with her. Margaret Hartley said this with the careful neutrality of a mother who has chosen her words in advance. She had a quality. People responded to her. She paused. "Women as well as men. I don't mean anything improper by it. She simply made people feel that she was genuinely interested in them. It's a gift, I suppose. Or it can be." "Or it can be something else," said Dr. Hartley from his armchair, not looking up from his cup. His wife gave him a quick glance. "Gerald, I'm only saying what people are thinking." He set down his cup. He was a forthright man, built for directness. "She was a charming woman, Miss Vain, and I'm sorry she's dead. But she wasn't uncomplicated. Philip spent a good deal of time at the Benham house over the summer. More than was, perhaps, well." He stopped himself. "These things happen. Young men and older women, and the usual muddle. I don't think she meant to encourage him particularly. But she didn't discourage him either, which amounts to the same thing in the end." "And Mr. Ashworth?" Miss Marple asked, and the question landed with the lightness of something dropped onto still water. Both the Hartleys were very quiet for a moment. Ashworth appeared in September, Dr. Hartley said. Philip had been established, let us say, for rather longer. It wasn't comfortable. He looked at Miss Marple directly. My son is not a violent young man, Miss Marple. I want to be clear about that. I'm sure he isn't, she said pleasantly. Margaret Hartley, she noticed, was looking at the fireplace with the fixed attention of a woman listening very carefully to a conversation she appears not to be following. Miss Marple walked home by way of Rook Cottage. This was not, strictly speaking, on her route, but Miss Marple had long taken the view that the shortest distance between 2 points is frequently the least instructive, and she was not in a hurry. And the cottage was a small stone building set back from the lane behind a low wall, and it bore the temporary look of a place where someone is staying rather than living, a difference that reveals itself in small ways. A single pair of boots outside the door. No plant on the sill. The curtains drawn in a particular fashion that suggested they had been closed once, for privacy, and not adjusted since. David Ashworth answered the door with the unguarded look of a man who is expecting someone else. "Oh," he said. Then he gathered himself pleasantly. "I'm sorry. I thought you might be the inspector." "I'm afraid not," said Miss Marple. "I'm only an elderly lady who has walked rather further than she intended and wondered if she might trouble you for a glass of water." He let her in without hesitation, which told her something. A guilty man, in her experience, does not let elderly ladies in without hesitation. He may let them in, but there is a hesitation. The cottage was neat in the unself-conscious way of a man who is used to travelling and has reduced his needs accordingly. There were books, real books, red ones with broken spines, and a typewriter on the table near the window. And beside the typewriter, a cup that had gone cold and a sheet of paper on which perhaps 6 lines had been written and then abandoned. He was, she concluded, genuinely trying to work. Grief, or something near it, was making it difficult. He brought her water and sat across from her at the small table with his hands around his cold cup. "You were at the supper," he said. "I remember seeing you." "I was. And you were acquainted with Miss Vain?" "Yes." He looked at the window. "We were friends. Good friends." He said it simply, without the particular emphasis people use when they mean something else. Miss Marple believed him, and noted that this was interesting rather than exculpatory. Had she mentioned anyone who might have wished her ill? She asked. Anyone in the village or elsewhere? He was quiet for a moment. Clara was. She had a complicated history. Not wicked, but complicated. He turned his cup slowly in his hands. She'd told me she felt watched the last few weeks. I thought she was anxious. I didn't take it seriously enough. He stopped. "What sort of complicated history?" Miss Marple asked. He looked at her then, with the direct appraisal of someone deciding how much of the truth is safe to speak to a stranger. She had been, he said carefully, connected to someone in this village. Before she came here, is someone who did not know she was coming and was not pleased to find her. Miss Marple set down her glass. "Did she tell you who?" "She didn't need to," he said. "It was rather obvious, once you knew what to look for." Chapter 4. The Obvious Suspect. Inspector Brent was not, by nature, a man who welcomed interference. He had a tidy mind and a preference for evidence that could be weighed, measured, and written in a straight line across a page. He had been a policeman for 19 years, and in that time had developed a reliable professional instinct which told him by Friday morning, that the answer to the death of Clara Vain was standing directly in front of him, wearing a good wool skirt and maintaining eye contact with the composure of someone who has decided that composure is her best defense. He called Evelyn Price back to the vestry at 10 o'clock. She came alone this time, without the taut wariness of the first interview. She had resolved something overnight, he thought, made some internal arrangement with herself about how this would go. She sat down across from him and folded her hands in the same precise way as before, as if the gesture were a door she was choosing to close. "I'll tell you what I didn't tell you yesterday," she said before he had spoken. "I knew Clara Vain, not as a neighbour. I knew her before she came to Little Dornford." Brent set down his pen with the careful patience of a man who has learned that speaking at the wrong moment costs more than silence. He waited. "She was involved with my husband," Mrs. Price said, 4 years ago, in Leamington, before we retired here. She paused. It lasted approximately 8 months, I found out. They ended it. George and I, we continued." She said this last word with a flatness that covered a great deal. "It was not easy, but we continued. And then in June, Clara Vain appeared in this village. Had she sought you out deliberately? That is what I asked myself. That is what I have asked myself every day since June." She looked at the narrow vestry window. "George says no. He says it was coincidence, that she had her own reasons for coming here, unconnected to us." She paused. "I do not believe in coincidence of that particular kind." "Did you speak to her about it, since she arrived?" "Once, in August. I went to the Benham house and I spoke to her." Something moved briefly across Evelyn Price's face. A controlled flicker of something old and unresolved. "She was perfectly pleasant. She said she hadn't intended to cause disruption. She said she had simply wanted somewhere quiet." A short silence. She seemed, if anything, faintly amused. "And that made you angry?" "Yes, Inspector, it made me angry." She said it without apology and without drama. "I am a human being." Brent studied her. She was, he thought, either entirely innocent or precisely the kind of person capable of a very controlled and deliberate act. The difficulty was that these were not, in his experience, mutually exclusive categories. "Mrs. Price," he said, "the jam you gave to Miss Vain. You said it was from your own stock, jars you had made in August. Would anyone else have had access to those jars? In your kitchen, your pantry?" She was quiet for a moment. "My kitchen is not locked. My husband comes and goes. Philip Hartley has had occasion to call at the house." She stopped. "And my sister was staying with us the week before the supper. Eleanor. She lives in Solihull. She was here 4 days." Brent wrote this down. "Did your sister know about the history with Miss Vain?" "Eleanor knows everything about my life," said Evelyn Price. "That is the nature of sisters." Miss Marple heard about this second interview from the vicar's wife, Mrs. Alsop, who had it from the vicar, who had it from George Price himself, in a state of some agitation on his doorstep at 11:30. Villages, as has been noted, have their own systems. She was in the church arranging flowers at the time, a task she had volunteered for on impulse, finding it useful to have reasons to be in the places where conversation naturally gathered. Mrs. Alsop was helping, or rather was standing beside the flowers and talking while Miss Marple arranged them. "Poor Evelyn," she said without sounding entirely convincing on the subject. "To have that woman appear here, of all places. And now, this." She handed Miss Marple a stem of late chrysanthemum without looking at it. Of course, everyone is saying, well, you can imagine what everyone is saying. I can imagine several things, said Miss Marple pleasantly. Which in particular? That Evelyn did it, of course. Mrs. Alsop lowered her voice to the register people use in churches when they are saying something they know they shouldn't. She gave her the slice herself. Everyone saw it. And she had every reason in the world. Every reason and every opportunity, Miss Marple agreed. She placed the chrysanthemum, considered it, moved it slightly left, which is, of course, rather a great deal to have. Mrs. Alsop looked at her uncertainly. I'm not sure I follow. Only that in my experience, said Miss Marple, the person with every reason and every opportunity is very often exactly that. A person with reasons and opportunities. Whether they made use of them is quite another matter. She tilted her head at the arrangement. Does that look even to you? I think the left side may be slightly heavy. Mrs. Alsop inspected the flowers with a distracted air. It looks perfectly fine to me. Said Miss Marple, and adjusted it anyway. George Price was in the garden when Miss Marple passed the house on her afternoon walk, standing among the late dahlias, with his hands at his sides and the look of a man who has come outside without quite remembering why. He was perhaps 60, soft around the edges in the way of men who were once more definite about things and have gradually been worn smooth by time and accommodation. He saw her and did not pretend not to. They'll arrest her, he said without introduction. Won't they? The way this is going, they'll arrest Evelyn. I think, said Miss Marple carefully, that Inspector Brent is a thorough man. He will want to be certain. She didn't do it. He said it with the force of someone who needs to hear the words in the open air. Whatever you may have heard, whatever anyone has said about the history of the thing, Evelyn is not capable of it. I'm sure she isn't, said Miss Marple. She was angry. She had a right to be angry. But there is an enormous distance between anger and he stopped. His hands moved briefly and settled again. Clara was not a wicked person, he said more quietly. She was careless. There is a difference. Yes, said Miss Marple, there is. He looked at her directly for the first time. He had, she noticed, the eyes of a man who has made one very large mistake and has been paying the interest on it ever since. Did you know her? He asked. Clara? No, I spoke with Mr. Ashworth. Something registered in his expression at the name, not quite surprise, not quite alarm. Something more internal than either. Ashworth, he repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. He seemed very affected by her death, said Miss Marple. A sincere grief, I thought. George Price looked back at his dahlias. Yes, he said, I expect it was. He said nothing more. But Miss Marple, walking on, had found herself returning to the pause before those words, the small, complicated silence of a man who knew something about David Ashworth's grief that he had chosen, very deliberately, not to say. Chapter 5. The jar that was not opened. The laboratory results arrived on Friday afternoon, and they confirmed what Inspector Brent had privately expected and publicly hoped would prove otherwise. The damson jam had contained aconitine, a sufficient quantity of it, introduced with some care, to kill a healthy adult within 2 to 3 hours of ingestion. It was not, the toxicologist's report noted with the brusque economy of scientific language, a substance that found its way into preserves by accident. It was derived from the monkshood plant, Aconitum napellus, and required deliberate extraction. Someone had known what they were doing, or had taken considerable trouble to learn. Brent read the report twice, then walked to the window of the vestry and looked at the churchyard for a long moment, thinking about Evelyn Price's steady pale eyes. He sent Sergeant Oakes to make further inquiries. Miss Marple heard about the monk's hood from Mrs. Fellows at tea-time, delivered with the careful gravity of someone who has been entrusted with important information and takes the responsibility seriously. "It grows in gardens," Mrs. Fellows said, pouring. "All over the village, as a matter of fact. I have some myself, at the back, under the wall. Very pretty flower, purplish blue. I've never touched it without gloves." "Very wise," said Miss Marple. "It is extraordinarily toxic, even the roots." "Well, that's just it." Mrs. Fellows set down the teapot. "Evelyn Price has a very fine stand of it, in her border. Has had for years. I remember admiring it." Miss Marple sipped her tea and said nothing. "Of course," Mrs. Fellows continued, with the tone of a person adding something they consider significant, "so does Dr. Hartley. He grows all manner of things for his medicinal herb garden. George Price told me he was rather knowledgeable about plant properties. Gave a little talk to the Women's Institute 3 years ago, apparently, on traditional herbal remedies." "Did he?" said Miss Marple. "And then there's Rook Cottage." Mrs. Fellows hesitated. "The Benham family who owned it used to keep a rather wild garden. It's mostly gone to seed now, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were monk's hoods still growing along the north wall. Plants of that sort persist." She paused. "Mr. E. Ashworth would have access to it naturally." "Naturally," said Miss Marple. She finished her tea, declined a biscuit, and said she thought she might look in on St. Crispin's Hall, if Mrs. Fellows didn't mind, as she had left her reading glasses somewhere the previous evening and wondered if they had been handed in. Mrs. Fellows said of course, and that she would keep supper warm. The parish hall was unlocked. This was not unusual. St. Crispin's operated on the trusting assumption that the village contained no one who would do anything in the parish hall that required the parish hall to be locked. Events of the past 48 hours had not yet disturbed this habit, though Miss Marple suspected they would eventually. The trestle table had been moved to one side and the chairs stacked. The bread was gone, taken, she understood, for analysis, along with what remained of the preserves. But the table itself still bore the faint rings of glasses, and the waxy residue of the breadcloth, and someone had left a folded serviette beside the far leg, which had been overlooked in the clearing up. Miss Marple was not looking for her reading glasses. She had not left them here. But she looked about the hall with the attentive quietness she brought to all such exercises, moving slowly along the table, seeing it as it had been, the loaves in their golden rows, the ramekins, the jars. She stopped. There had been, she was quite certain, 7 jars of preserve on the table. She had counted them in the way that people who pay attention count things, not deliberately, but as a function of noticing. 7 jars, 3 of damson, 2 of quince, 1 of Mr. Selby's chutney, and 1 of what had appeared to be a rose hip jelly, deep and reddish, in a slightly taller jar than the others. The police had catalogued 6 jars, according to Mrs. Fellows, who had this from Sergeant Oakes. 3 damson, 2 quince, 1 chutney. No rose hip jelly. Miss Marple stood very still in the middle of the hall and thought about this with the careful deliberateness of someone fitting a piece into a puzzle that has not yet revealed its full shape. It was possible the rose hip jar had been removed before the police arrived to catalogue the table. It was possible It had belonged to a guest who had brought it and taken it home. It was possible she had miscounted. She considered these possibilities in order and found them each unsatisfying in their own particular way. Then she walked to the far side of the hall, where the kitchen hatch opened into the small serving kitchen, and looked through it. The kitchen was tidy. A folded cloth over the tap, a row of empty cake tins on the shelf, and on the windowsill, not quite visible from the main hall, a single jar with a handwritten label, the writing rubbed partially away by what appeared to be moisture, containing a dark reddish preserve. It had been set there, she thought, rather than left there. The distinction was small and not provable, and entirely clear to her. She did not touch it. She looked at it for some time, noted the label's remaining letter, a clear upright capital E, and then walked back through the hall and out into the early evening with the careful pace of someone who has found something and does not wish to appear to have found it. And Philip Hartley was leaning against the churchyard wall as she came out, with the particular studied casualness of someone who has been waiting and does not want it known. He straightened when he saw her, and for a moment looked very young indeed. "Miss Marple," he said, "I wondered if I might speak with you." "Of course," she said, and waited. He looked at the ground, then up. "I need to tell someone something. Someone who isn't the police." He stopped. "Not because it's incriminating. Because I'm not sure what it means, and I don't want to point a finger wrongly." "That is a thoughtful position," said Miss Marple. He took a breath. "The night of the supper. Before it began, when people were still arriving, I was early. I came to help set out the chairs." He paused. "I saw someone in the kitchen, through the hatch. They were at the table, with their back to me. They were doing something with the jars, handling them, rearranging them, I thought. I assumed it was Evelyn Price. It seemed natural. It was her kitchen, her supper." "But it was not Mrs. Price," said Miss Marple. He looked at her sharply. "No. She came in from the main door about 10 minutes later, while I was still setting chairs. She'd been outside speaking to the vicar. I saw them come in together." He hesitated. "So whoever I saw in the kitchen before, it wasn't her. Did you see their face?" "No, only their back, and their hands, briefly, when they turned slightly." He stopped. "But you noticed something," Miss Marple said. "Not a question." "The hands," he said reluctantly. "They were careful, very precise and careful, of the way a person is when they're concentrating on something that matters." He looked at her. "Does that make sense?" "Perfectly," said Miss Marple. She thanked him, said good evening, and walked back toward the cottage, with the steady, quiet step of someone in whom something important has just settled into place. Not the whole of it, not yet, but enough of it to know the shape of what remains. Chapter 6. What Remains. Beneath Politeness. Saturday morning arrived in Little Dornford, with the particular grey stillness of a village that has been frightened and is attempting to behave normally. People went about their usual errands with a quality of deliberateness, a performance of the ordinary that was in itself slightly extraordinary. The post office opened at its usual time. The church bell rang for morning prayers, and was answered by a congregation somewhat larger than usual, which is always the way of things when death has recently made itself local. Miss Marple did not go to morning prayers. She went instead to call on Eleanor Marsh. George Price had mentioned a sister staying the week before the supper. Mrs. Fellows had provided her surname and her address in the village. She was staying on, it seemed, having delayed her return to Solihull out of loyalty to her sister, or something that resembled loyalty, or perhaps something that merely resembled it from a distance. She had taken a room at the Feathers Inn on the far side of the green, and she was in it when Miss Marple knocked, which suggested she had not gone to prayers either. Eleanor Marsh was 5 years younger than Evelyn Price, and gave an impression entirely different. Where her sister was solid and composed, Eleanor was thin and quick, and dressed in colours that seemed slightly too bright for her circumstances, as if chosen in another mood. She had the eyes of a woman who observes a great deal, and is often disappointed by what she sees. She looked at Miss Marple on the doorstep, with a frank appraisal that Miss Marple found rather refreshing. "You're the elderly lady David Ashworth mentioned," she said, "the one who called on him asking for water." "Guilty," said Miss Marple pleasantly. Eleanor stood aside to let her in. The room was small and showed the signs of an extended stay. A folded cardigan over the chair. Books on the sill, the accumulation of someone who came for a few days and has been here a fortnight. On the table was a cup of coffee, still steaming, and beside it a letter that Eleanor turned face down, with a movement quick enough to be noticed and slow enough to be, perhaps, intentional. "You know, Mr. Ashworth," Miss Marple observed, sitting in the offered chair. "We've spoken since everything happened." Eleanor sat across from her, crossing her ankles in the manner of a woman who has been told since childhood to sit properly and has largely complied. "He's very cut up about it. Clara, I mean," she paused. "I didn't know Clara well. Evelyn didn't encourage it." "Understandably." "Yes." Eleanor looked at her coffee cup. "And yet, you know, Evelyn was the one who invited her." Miss Marple was still. "To the supper. She sent her a note. 3 weeks before. Said something about wanting to start the new season without unpleasantness, with things on a civilized footing." Eleanor's voice was careful, performing fairness. "Evelyn has very strong feelings about civilization. She believes it can be imposed on situations that don't naturally have it." A pause. Clara wrote back and accepted. "Did you know about the note before it was sent?" Eleanor looked up. "I suggested it," she said quietly. "I was staying here, as you know. I could see how it was wearing on Evelyn. The woman being in the village, the daily possibility of encountering her, the strain of it. I thought, if they could simply acknowledge each other at a public event, without drama, it might release some of the pressure." She stopped. "I was trying to help." "Of course you were," said Miss Marple. "And now Evelyn is the primary suspect in a poisoning case," Eleanor said flatly, "and I am the person who arranged for the victim to be in the room." She said it with the bleak precision of someone who has been awake for 2 nights turning this over. "You can see why I haven't been to prayers." Miss Marple studied her for a moment. The rigidity of the shoulders, the turned-down letter, the coffee going cold while she sat with her hands in her lap. Eleanor Marsh was frightened, yes, but there was something else operating alongside the fear, a quality of watchfulness that was not quite the same as innocence. "You were here for 4 days before the supper," Miss Marple said. "You were in and out of your sister's house during that time." "Yes, and her kitchen, presumably." Eleanor's gaze was steady. I helped with the bread on the Wednesday." "Evelyn is very particular about her bread. She doesn't usually allow assistance, but her wrist had been troubling her, and she let me help with the kneading." She paused. "I did not touch the jam." "No," said Miss Marple, "but you knew which jars she intended to bring." A silence opened between them, wider than the small room quite accommodated. "I knew," Eleanor said at last. She'd set them out on the pantry shelf 3 days before. The damson ones, specifically. She was proud of this year's batch. Her voice shifted slightly. A fraction flatter, a fraction more deliberate. "I told David Ashworth about the supper, incidentally. Mentioned that Clara had been invited. We'd had a brief conversation in the village the week before. He seemed worried about Clara. And I thought knowing she'd have a public occasion, a safe social setting, might reassure him." "That was kind," said Miss Marple. "I thought so." Eleanor looked out the window at the grey-green. "Though I understand it looks rather less kind now, in retrospect." Miss Marple rose to leave, and then paused in the way she had, the apparently spontaneous pause of someone who has just remembered something inconsequential. "The rose-hip jelly," she said, "on the supper table. Was that one of your sisters?" Eleanor turned from the window, and there it was, the thing Miss Marple had been waiting for. Not guilt, not alarm, but a very particular quality of blankness. The expression of a person who has prepared answers to many questions and has not prepared an answer to this one. "I don't remember any rose-hip jelly," Eleanor said. "No," said Miss Marple. "I don't suppose you do." She said good morning and let herself out, and walked back across the green in the thin autumn light, feeling the pieces shift and rearrange themselves in her mind with the slow, certain movement of things finding their proper places. She passed George Price on the lane, coming from the direction of Rook Cottage. He saw her and did not alter his pace, which was itself a kind of alteration. He looked as he had in the garden, soft, sagging, wearing his guilt like a coat that no longer quite fits. "I've been to see Ashworth," he said when they were level. "Yes," said Miss Marple. He stopped walking. "He told me something. About Clara. About why she came here." He looked at a point somewhere past Miss Marple's left shoulder. "She wasn't running away from anything. I think she was protecting something. Someone." He stopped again. "She wasn't careless. I was wrong to say that. She was cautious. She had always been cautious. The carelessness was mine." Miss Marple waited. Ashworth thinks the same person who killed her had been following her movements for some time, knew her habits. George Price finally looked at Miss Marple directly, and in his expression was something she had not seen there before. Not grief, exactly, and not fear, but something that sat between them. Someone who knew she would be at that supper. Someone who knew which jar would reach her. "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. "Someone who knew all of that, and knew it rather in advance." George Price put his hands in his pockets and walked on toward his house and did not look back. Miss Marple watched him go, and then thought about the letter on Eleanor Marsh's table, turned face down with the quick, practiced movement of someone with a habit of concealment, and thought about the way the name Ashworth had registered in his face the previous afternoon, not as surprise, but as something older and more complicated. The village was very quiet. Somewhere behind the church, a wood-pigeon called and stopped and called again, as if uncertain whether its news was worth repeating. Chapter 7. The Letter That Was Not for the Inspector. Sunday arrived with weak sunshine and the smell of rain that had fallen in the night. Miss Marple was up before 7, which was not unusual for her, and had made herself tea on Mrs. Fellows's kitchen stove before her hostess had come downstairs, which was unusual enough that Mrs. Fellows commented on it when she appeared in her dressing gown at 1:30. "You look," she said, studying Miss Marple with the frankness of a woman in her own home. "As though you've been thinking." "I have been," said Miss Marple. "I find early mornings very useful for it. Things arrange themselves rather more honestly when there's no one about to interrupt them." She had in fact been sitting at the kitchen table for the better part of an hour, with her hands around her cup and her eyes on the middle distance, which Mrs. Fellows's cat, a large, indifferent tabby named Constance, had periodically crossed without improving or disrupting the view. Miss Marple had been thinking about the letter, and about what George Price had said on the lane, and about a small specific thing that had occurred to her in the night, as small specific things often do, which connected two other things she had not previously thought to connect. She said none of this to Mrs. Fellows. She said that the tea was very good, and that she thought it might clear up by afternoon. The thing that had occurred to her in the night concerned the timing. Evelyn Price had set the jam jars on the pantry shelf 3 days before the supper. Eleanor Marsh had known this. Eleanor Marsh had also spoken with David Ashworth in the week preceding the supper and mentioned that Clara Vain would be attending. These were, individually, unremarkable facts. Placed beside each other, in the particular order in which they had occurred, they became something rather different. But there was a fourth element, and it was the fourth element that had woken Miss Marple at 5:30 with the quiet certainty of something long overdue. She needed to see the letter. She did not go to Eleanor Marsh directly. She went first to the parish hall, where Sergeant Oakes was doing a second sweep of the premises under Inspector Brent's instructions, and where she was able, with the appearance of complete accident, to raise the matter of the jar on the kitchen windowsill. Sergeant Oakes, a young man with an open face and the comfortable manner of someone who has not yet learned to be suspicious of elderly ladies, looked at her with appropriate attention. "The rose-hip jar. Yes, we've got it. Inspector Brent had it collected yesterday evening. Had it been tested? That's ongoing." He paused, as with the slight hesitation of a man uncertain how much he is permitted to say. "The label was interesting. What remained of it?" He seemed to make a decision. "The E you mentioned to the inspector. It wasn't the initial of the maker. We think it may be the initial of the intended recipient." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. "The jar was meant for someone whose name begins with E. That's the working theory." He glanced toward the door as if checking they were unobserved, which they were. "If there was aconitine in it, and we expect there may well be, it wouldn't have been left on the supper table unless something went wrong. Unless someone moved it, or it ended up in the wrong position, or—" He stopped himself. "Or it wasn't meant for the supper table at all." "No," said Miss Marple, very gently. "I don't believe it was." She left him to his work and walked out into the thin Sunday morning with the careful movement of someone recalibrating their understanding of a situation that has just shifted significantly on its axis. Clara Vain had not been the intended victim. She had been, in some terrible and specific sense, in the wrong place at the right time, or the right place at the wrong time, depending on which direction one was standing when the event occurred. The jar had been placed not to poison Clara Vain, but to poison someone else entirely. And the damson jam, Evelyn Price's damson jam, in Evelyn Price's particular jar, had been the instrument of a separate, simultaneous plan that had succeeded where the first had apparently failed. Two intentions, occupying the same evening. One executed, one interrupted or abandoned, you're overtaken by events. Miss Marple thought about this all the way to the Feathers Inn. Eleanor Marsh answered the door in her coat, which suggested she had been about to go out, or wished to give the impression that she had been. She looked at Miss Marple with the expression of someone who has been expecting a visit and has not enjoyed the anticipation. "I thought you'd come back," she said. "I thought I would too," said Miss Marple. She was let in again. The room had the slightly reduced feeling of somewhere a person has been preparing to leave. The cardigan folded more precisely over the chair, the books stacked rather than merely set. The letter, Miss Marple noticed immediately, was gone from the table. "The letter you received yesterday," said Miss Marple, sitting without being invited. "I wonder if you might show it to me." Eleanor remained standing. "It's a private letter." "I'm sure it is. Most of the important ones are." Miss Marple placed her hands in her lap. "I ask because I believe it may be relevant to something the police have discovered this morning, and because I think you already know that, which is why you've put it somewhere other than the table." The silence lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Eleanor Marsh looked at the window, then at her coat sleeves, then at Miss Marple, with the expression of a woman who has run out of angles to stand at. She opened her handbag and produced the letter. It was handwritten, 2 pages, on plain notepaper. The handwriting was precise and slightly backward slanting, the hand of someone who had been taught copperplate and had spent years working against it. Miss Marple read it without haste, and without any change in her expression, which was the expression of someone reading something that confirms rather than surprises. It was from David Ashworth. It had been written, she noted from the date, the Wednesday before the harvest supper, the same day Evelyn Price had made her bread, the same day Eleanor Marsh had helped with the kneading. In it, Ashworth wrote with a directness that suggested he and Eleanor had established a private correspondence of some duration. He wrote that he was worried about Clara, that someone had been in the garden at Brook Cottage 2 nights before. He had heard them from his window. That Clara had been more frightened than she admitted, and that her fear had a specific quality. It was not the fear of a stranger, but the fear of someone known. And he wrote that he had his own suspicions about who might wish Clara harm, and that those suspicions pointed not toward the direction that convenient circumstance seemed to suggest. He wrote near the end of the letter 1 sentence that Miss Marple read twice. "She told me in September that if anything happened to her, the reason would not be jealousy. It would be what she found out in August, and who she told." Miss Marple set the letter down on the table between them. "What did Clara Vain find out in August?" she asked. Eleanor Marsh sat down slowly, as if her legs had made the decision without consulting her. "She came to see me," she said, "not Evelyn, me, in Solihull, in August. She drove up." She paused. "She'd found something. About George. About George Price. About what George had been doing." She stopped again, and in the pause was something that had been held for a long time. Not the affair. Something else. Something that had nothing to do with Clara, directly, except that she'd stumbled onto it. A financial matter. Properties in Leamington. Transactions that weren't right. Money that had moved in directions it had no business moving. Eleanor's voice was flat with the effort of saying it plainly. George had been defrauding a client, a significant fraud over several years. Clara had found documentation. She'd worked briefly for the firm before the affair, and she'd kept certain papers. She didn't know what to do with them. "So she came to you," said Miss Marple, "because I'm Evelyn's sister, and because she was, I think, a fundamentally decent person who did not want to destroy a man without giving someone connected to him the chance to address it first." Eleanor looked at her hands. "I told George that same week. I told him Clara had the documentation and had shown it to me." "And George," said Miss Marple, "would have understood precisely what that meant." "Yes." Eleanor's voice was barely above a murmur. "He would have understood that it was not merely his marriage at risk. It was everything." Miss Marple sat very still. "The jar with the E on the label," she said quietly. "It wasn't meant for Evelyn." Eleanor looked up. Her eyes were very clear and very frightened. "No," she said, "I don't think it was." Chapter 8. The Patience of Patient Men. Miss Marple spent Sunday afternoon in her room at Mrs. Fellows's cottage, which she did not often do. She sat in the chair by the window with her knitting in her hands, and worked 2 full inches of the sleeve she had been neglecting for a fortnight, and thought. The knitting was useful. People who do not knit frequently underestimate the quality of attention it frees, the hands occupied with their small mechanical work, while the mind moves at its own unhurried pace through the material presented to it. Miss Marple had solved a number of difficult problems over the years in precisely this fashion, and had sometimes wondered whether the solutions would have come at all without the needles. By 4 o'clock she had 3 inches of sleeve, and a very clear picture of what she needed to do. The difficulty with George Price was this. He was a patient man. Our Miss Marple had known a number of criminals over the course of her life, and had observed that they fell broadly into 2 temperamental categories. There were those who acted from passion, sudden, often poorly planned, leaving traces everywhere because passion is by nature untidy. And there were those who acted from calculation, slow, methodical, leaving fewer traces, because calculation is by nature careful. George Price was the second kind. The fraud itself demonstrated it. Years of careful misdirection, small adjustments, the management of appearances. The attempt on Eleanor's life, if that was what the rose-hip jar represented, showed the same quality. A man who had learned of a threat, assessed it, and moved to resolve it in a manner that would produce the minimum of disruption. And the fact that Clara Vain had died instead of Eleanor was not, Miss Marple thought, a failure of his plan. It was an additional element of it. He had, she believed, arranged for both deaths. He had tampered with the damson jam in Evelyn's pantry during those 4 days when Eleanor was staying at the house and the kitchen was less closely watched than usual, knowing that Evelyn would almost certainly serve it to Clara, given the history between them. The rose-hip jar, introduced to the supper table separately, had been intended for Eleanor. But something had gone wrong with the placement. Philip Hartley's witness to careful hands rearranging jars now took on a new and specific meaning, and the jar had ended up on the kitchen windowsill rather than the table. Eleanor had never received it. George Price, standing in his garden on Friday, hearing that Miss Marple had spoken to Ashworth, had understood that the net was drawing tighter. His visit to Ashworth on Sunday morning, the visit he had mentioned to her on the lane, had not been grief. It had been reconnaissance. This was what Miss Marple had concluded by 4 o'clock. The difficulty was that conclusions, however sound, are not evidence. Inspector Brent required evidence. And George Price, patient man that he was, would not supply it through confession or carelessness, or the spontaneous guilt that undoes the passionate criminal. He would need to be moved, carefully, in a specific direction. She telephoned the Price house at 4:30 and asked to speak to George. He came to the telephone with the measured calm of a man who has been waiting for calls and has prepared himself for each of them. "Mr. Price," she said pleasantly. "I do hope I'm not disturbing you. I find myself in a slight difficulty and wonder if I might ask your advice. It concerns something Mr. Ashworth said to me on my visit, something I've been rather uncertain whether to pass on to Inspector Brent." There was a pause of perhaps 2 seconds. "Oh," he said, "he mentioned that Clara had kept documentation of some kind, related to a professional matter. I wasn't entirely sure I understood the significance, but he seemed to feel the police ought to know about it. And I said I would speak to you first, as someone with legal experience, before troubling them with something that may be quite irrelevant." She paused. "I wondered if we might have a brief word this evening. In person, I always feel these things are clearer." Another pause, longer this time. "Of course," said George Price. "Come at 6. She arrived at 6:05 to find him alone in the sitting room. Evelyn was at her sister's, he explained, which Miss Marple had expected. She had telephoned Eleanor at the Feathers Inn at 5 o'clock to suggest she visit her sister this evening and not wait up. The sitting room was a well-maintained room, with the slightly unlived-in quality of spaces, kept for guests and used by the household only when occasion demands. George Price had lit the fire, which was considerate, and poured 2 small sherries, which told her he had decided on a particular approach to the evening. He handed her the glass and sat in the armchair across from her, with the composed stillness of someone who has rehearsed his position. "You mentioned documentation," he said. He kept his voice entirely level. This required effort, and Miss Marple noted the effort without remarking on it. "Yes," she said, "though I wonder now whether I described it quite accurately." She sipped her sherry. What Mr. Ashworth actually said was that Clara had told someone she trusted, before she died, about what she had found. Something shifted, very slightly, in his posture. "What she had found," he repeated, "about the Leamington properties." Miss Marple looked at the fire. "The documentation itself is apparently in very safe hands. Mr. Ashworth was quite emphatic about that Clara had ensured it was somewhere it would survive her, whatever happened." She paused. A very prudent woman, as it turns out. She did not look at him as she said this. She looked at the fire, but she was acutely aware of the quality of the silence that followed. Its particular texture, its weight, the way it was held by a man who is no longer entirely certain of his position, and is assessing, with the rapid calculation of a professional, what remains available to him. "That's reassuring to hear," he said at last. The words were ordinary. The flatness behind them was not. "Isn't it?" said Miss Marple. She set down her sherry glass on the side table and looked at him then, directly, with the mild, unhurried attention she had been giving people for 7 decades. And George Price looked back at her with the pale, careful expression of a man who has just understood that he has been in this room not as the host, but as the observed. "You're not uncertain at all," he said quietly. "About what to tell the inspector?" "No," said Miss Marple. "I'm afraid I'm not." The fire settled, sending a small shower of sparks up the chimney. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Outside, a car passed on the lane, its headlights sweeping briefly across the window and moving on. "I see," said George Price. He said it the way a man says something when he has reached the end of a long road, and found it is not the road he had intended to take, and knows now that there is no path back to the beginning. Not defeated, not confessional, simply arrived. Miss Marple had seen this expression before, on 2 occasions, and had never found it anything other than profoundly sad. "I think," she said with great gentleness, "that you should telephone Inspector Brent yourself, before the morning." She rose from her chair. "I think that would be considerably better, for Evelyn and for you, than the alternative." He did not answer, but when she reached the door, he had not moved to stop her, and his hand, she noticed, was resting on the telephone table beside the armchair. Chapter 9. What Miss Marple Knew. Inspector Brent arrived at Mrs. Fellows's cottage at 8 o'clock on Monday morning with the look of a man who has had a long night and is not entirely certain how to feel about it. George Price had telephoned him at 9:30 the previous evening. The conversation had lasted 40 minutes. A second, longer conversation, with a solicitor present and a recorder running, had taken place at the station in Leamington until well past midnight. A George Price had not confessed to murder in any of the legal language that the inspector would have preferred. He had, however, confirmed a number of specific facts that, taken together, formed a structure that a good prosecuting counsel would find serviceable. Brent accepted Mrs. Fellows's offer of coffee with the gratitude of a man for whom caffeine has become load-bearing, and sat across from Miss Marple at the kitchen table, while Constance the cat arranged herself on the window-sill with the serene indifference of a creature to whom human difficulties are a permanent background condition. "I would like," said Brent with careful politeness, "to understand how you got there. From the beginning, if you don't mind." "I don't mind at all," said Miss Marple. "Though I should say that I didn't get there so much as arrive, gradually, by a rather indirect route. These things rarely proceed in straight lines." "From the beginning," Brent repeated, with the patience of a man who has learned that patience is its own form of authority. Miss Marple folded her hands on the table. "The first thing I noticed," she said, "was not a fact but a quality. At the supper, before anything had happened, when Mrs. Price served that slice of bread to Miss Vain, there was something in the manner of it, a deliberateness. People who are making a social gesture of reconciliation tend to perform it with a kind of visible effort. The smile that is slightly too wide, the warmth that announces itself. Mrs. Price's gesture was quiet, contained. It looked, if anything, like relief." She paused. "A woman who has just poisoned someone does not look relieved. She looks controlled. And these are different things, and they feel different to watch. You suspected she was innocent from the start. I thought she was probably innocent. There's a difference." Miss Marple accepted the coffee Mrs. Fellows placed before her with a murmur of thanks. "The second thing was the jar. 7 jars on that table. I was quite certain of it, and the police catalogued 6. When I found the rose-hip jar in the kitchen, I knew it had been placed rather than forgotten. Nobody forgets a jar they've brought. And the label, the E, suggested it had been intended for a specific person, not left out for general consumption. Eleanor Marsh, who had, as I discovered, done 2 things of great significance. She had told George about Clara's documentation in August, which gave George his motive, and she had told David Ashworth about the supper, which told George that Ashworth was in Clara's confidence and might know what Clara knew. Eleanor had connected all the points on the map without realizing she had done so. Brent was writing steadily. "And Ashworth, where does he fit? He was what he appeared to be, a friend of Clara's, perhaps rather more than a friend, who knew enough about her situation to be frightened for her, but not quite enough to prevent what happened. His grief was genuine, His letter to Eleanor was genuine. He had his own suspicions about George Price. He mentioned that Clara's fear had the quality of someone known to her, not a stranger. But suspicion without evidence is a difficult thing to act on. She sipped her coffee. He was also, I think, the reason the rosehip jar never reached Eleanor. And when Philip Hartley saw those careful hands rearranging jars before the supper, it was George, placing the rosehip jar in a position where Eleanor would be served from it. But Ashworth arrived early, separately, and I believe he went to the kitchen and moved things, not knowing what he was moving, or why, simply tidying, making space. The jar ended up on the windowsill and stayed there. An accident that saved her life. Yes, though George didn't know that until much later. He believed for some time that Eleanor had simply not eaten the jelly. It wasn't until the police began cataloguing the table that he understood the jar had never reached her. Brent set down his pen for a moment. The fraud itself. Did you know about that before Mrs. Marsh told you? I suspected something of that nature. George Price, who when he mentioned Clara on Friday, corrected himself. He said she had been careless, then walked it back. A man who feels guilt about an affair calls the woman careless, as a way of distributing blame. But the correction suggested he knew her in a more specific way than that, knew that she had been in fact quite precise and careful. It pointed towards something professional, something documented. She paused. And then there was the question of why Clara Vain came to Little Dornford at all. She was not running from George. She was, as he told me, she was not. I always find it useful to note what people say when they are correcting impressions they haven't verified you hold. She was watching him. Keeping proximity to the evidence she had found, perhaps, or simply ensuring he knew she could act at any moment. It was leverage of a quiet kind, which made her dangerous, permanently dangerous. That is the essential point. An angry woman is dangerous until she cools. A woman with documentation is dangerous indefinitely. Miss Marple looked at the window. George Price understood this. He is a patient man, Inspector. Patient and methodical. The fraud required years of careful management. He brought the same quality to this. He waited until he had a situation, Eleanor's visit, the supper, the access to the kitchen. That gave him two resolutions at once. Clara gone, Eleanor gone, and his wife, with her 30-year history of damson jam and her very obvious motive, placed precisely where suspicion would naturally land. A silence settled over the kitchen table. Even Constance seemed to pause in her window arrangements. He used Evelyn, Brent said. He had been using Evelyn for a great many years, said Miss Marple quietly. That part, I think, is the saddest of it. She invited Clara out of a genuine effort at dignity. And George saw the invitation, and saw his opportunity, and used both of them, his wife's civility and his wife's jam, as the instruments of what he intended. She set down her cup. He told me on Sunday that he didn't believe in coincidence of a particular kind. He was quoting Evelyn, of course. He'd heard her say it so often it had become his own. Brent gathered his notes. He looked, she thought, not exactly satisfied. Satisfaction is too simple an emotion for the conclusion of a case of this nature. But resolved. Settled, in the way of a man who has found the last piece and confirmed that the picture it reveals is the one he suspected. You telephoned him, he said, on Sunday evening. You gave him the chance to come to us himself. I thought it was better, said Miss Marple, for Evelyn, principally. A husband who telephones the police himself is a different kind of story than a husband who is led out of the house in front of the village. She will have enough to manage. The story need not be more public than it must be. That was a considerable risk. He might have run. He might have, Miss Marple agreed, but patient men rarely run. Running is an act of impulse, and George Price is not, in any respect, an impulsive man. She paused. Also, he knew by then that I had visited Eleanor, and that Eleanor had shown me the letter, and that the letter mentioned the documentation being in safe hands. He understood that running would accomplish nothing. She folded her hands. He is, whatever else, an intelligent man. Intelligence of a certain kind eventually arrives, through its own calculations, at the same place that honesty would have taken a person much sooner. Brent stood, tucking his notebook away. I'll need a formal statement, Miss Marple. Of course, she said, this afternoon if it suits. He thanked her and thanked Mrs. Fellows, and let himself out into the bright, cold Monday morning. Miss Marple heard his car start, and then the quiet of the kitchen returned, it broken only by Constance dropping from the windowsill to the floor with a soft thud, and proceeding to her bowl with the focused urgency of a creature for whom breakfast is the only mystery worth solving. Chapter 10. What the Village Keeps. 3 weeks after the harvest supper, Little Dornford held its Remembrance Sunday service with the usual solemnity and the usual attendance, and if the village felt, in some collective and unspoken way, that it had rather a great deal to remember. This year, beyond the names on the war memorial, nobody said so directly. This was, Miss Marple reflected, one of the genuinely admirable qualities of English village life, not the absence of feeling, which is sometimes mistaken for it, but the understanding that feeling has its proper place and its proper time, and that neither is necessarily the present moment. She had stayed on longer than Louise had intended to drive her home. Louise, who was a kind girl, and perceptive enough to understand when something is not yet finished without being told, had come and gone twice, and had now been dispatched back to St. Mary Mead with Miss Marple's bags and a promise that she would collect her on the Wednesday, which gave Miss Marple 2 more days, and was precisely what she needed. She spent them quietly, in the way she spent most things. Evelyn Price did not leave the village. This surprised some people who had expected, or perhaps hoped, in the complicated way of communities that have been disturbed and want the disturbance fully removed, that she would go to a sister, or a cousin, or simply somewhere else. She did not, and she remained in the house on the lane with its border of dahlias, now black and frost-killed, and its pantry of preserves, and its 31 years of accumulated life, and she received visitors, or she did not, and she managed, in the way that certain women of her particular formation manage things, not by diminishing the weight of them, but by standing more squarely under it. Miss Marple called on her on the Tuesday morning. The house was tidier than it needed to be, the particular tidiness of someone who has been keeping their hands occupied, and Evelyn Price answered the door in her good cardigan with her hair done, and the expression of a woman who has decided what face the world will see, and has put it on with some care. She was pale, but her eyes were as steady as they had been in the vestry, and which told Miss Marple that the steadiness was constitutional rather than performed. She let her in without warmth and without coldness. She made tea with the automatic precision of someone for whom the ritual is its own sufficiency. They sat in the front room, where the fire was laid but not lit, and outside the frost-killed garden was very still in the November light. "I owe you an apology," Evelyn said when she had poured. She said it as a statement rather than an approach. a fact she was putting down on the table between them, not a sentiment she was offering. "You don't," said Miss Marple. "I thought, for a time, that you were interfering, that you were one of those people who involve themselves in things for the interest of it." She looked at her cup. "I understand now that you were preventing something. I am not entirely certain what it was you prevented, beyond the obvious." "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that without certain conversations being had, Inspector Brent might have arrived at a conclusion that was convenient rather than true. He's a thorough man, but thoroughness is not always sufficient when a situation has been arranged to point in a particular direction." Evelyn said nothing for a moment. "He arranged it around me," she said, "around my jam, my bread, my invitation to Clara." She said each item with the flat precision of someone reading from an inventory. "He knew I would invite her, because he knew me. He knew I would serve her specifically, because he knew me. He used—" She stopped. "Yes," said Miss Marple gently, 31 years. Evelyn looked at the unlit fire. "And some portion of that was, I suppose, genuinely what it appeared to be. The ordinary life of an ordinary marriage. Children, if we'd had them. The garden, the bread." She was quiet for a moment. "I keep returning to the bread, that he would use the bread I made." She shook her head, not in incomprehension, but in something more final, the gesture of a woman closing a door on a room she will not re-enter. Miss Marple did not offer comfort. She had learned over many years that comfort offered to certain people at certain moments is simply a form of imposition, the comforter's need projected onto someone who requires instead the simple companionship of being witnessed. She sat and drank her tea and was present, and this was enough. After a while, Evelyn said, "Eleanor thinks I should sell the house. What do you think? I think Eleanor has always found it easier to move away from things than to stand in front of them." She looked at the window. "This is my village. I was born here. My mother is buried in St. Crispin's churchyard." A pause. "I shall stay." "Good," said Miss Marple simply. Evelyn looked at her with the first expression that was not composed. A brief, unguarded thing, quickly recovered. "You think so? I think that the village needs you rather more than you need the village, though it doesn't yet know that. Communities that have been disturbed need people who know how to stand still in the middle of them." Miss Marple set down her cup. "You have always known how to do that, Mrs. Price. It is, I suspect, one of the things that made you useful to a man who preferred not to stand still himself." Evelyn received this in silence. Then she nodded, once with the deliberate quality of someone accepting a truth that is uncomfortable and necessary, and ultimately beneath the discomfort, rather clarifying. Miss Marple walked back across the green for the last time on Wednesday morning, waiting for Louise's car, with the village going about its business around her in the pale November light. Mr. Dodd was opening the post office. The vicar was walking his small dog along the church path. Two women she didn't know were talking at the corner with the absorbed particularity of people exchanging something important and stopped when they saw her, and one of them raised a hand in greeting, which Miss Marple returned. The Philip Hartley passed on his bicycle and slowed. "Leaving today," he said, "this morning." She looked at him with the frank assessment she always gave to young people who were in the process of becoming something, which most young people are. He looked better than he had on the bench by the war memorial. Not repaired, but reoriented. Grief, when it is honest, tends to clarify rather than merely diminish. "I've been thinking," he said, stopping the bicycle with his foot on the ground, "about what she said to me once. Clara. She said that the most dangerous people are the ones who've convinced themselves they're being reasonable. He looked at the road. I didn't understand it at the time. No, said Miss Marple. One rarely does when someone says it. It requires a specific example to become comprehensible. He almost smiled. She was rather clever. She was, Miss Marple agreed, and rather brave, in a quiet way. The quiet kind of brave is frequently the more costly variety. He pushed off on his bicycle and rode away down the lane, and Miss Marple watched him go with the mild, affectionate attention she gave to young people who were going to be all right, which she believed he would be. Louise arrived at 9:10, cheerful and slightly wind-blown and apologetic about the time. She took Miss Marple's remaining bag and held the car door with the elaborate care of a young woman who has been told once that Miss Marple is not fragile and has not quite believed it. As they pulled out of the village and onto the road that wound back towards St. Mary Mead through the frost-pale countryside, Louise glanced sideways. Will you think about it much? After. After what, dear? All of it. The case. The whole business. Miss Marple looked out at the hedgerows going past, winter bare and very clear in the morning light. A kestrel hung above a field for a long moment, absolutely still against the moving air, and then dropped from sight. I shall think about Evelyn Price, she said, as an example of a particular kind of courage that is not much celebrated because it doesn't announce itself. She paused, and I shall think about Clara Vain, who was careful and decent and made one significant error, which was to trust that the person she was cautious of would remain the kind of man who responds to caution rather than to threat. Another pause. We are all, I think, inclined to believe that people will remain what they have been. It's a very human error, and quite a costly one. Louise drove in silence for a moment. And Mr. Price? Miss Marple was quiet for a little while. The countryside moved past in its November quietness, and the sky was the clean, washed blue that comes after frost, and the road ahead was empty and perfectly clear. I shall think about him least of all, she said at last. There is a certain kind of intelligent man who has spent so long calculating the behaviour of others that he has entirely neglected to examine his own. He believes he is reasoning when he is only, in fact, justifying. She folded her hands in her lap. I have known one or two. They are always rather surprised by themselves at the end. They shouldn't be. She said nothing further. Louise, who had the good sense of a person who knows when conversation has reached its natural conclusion, did not press. The village of Little Dornford fell away behind them into the middle distance, and then into the kind of distance where things become indistinguishable from the general landscape, and then were gone entirely. Miss Marple looked at the road ahead and thought, briefly and without sentiment, about warm bread and cold calculation, and about the particular cruelty of the ordinary world, which is that it continues to look so very much like itself, even after everything has changed. Then she unfolded her knitting from her bag, settled it in her lap, and continued the sleeve.